So immunity in general, that really just means the ability to recognize and respond to pathogens and other particles, organisms, chemicals that are not native to our own body. So the kind of subtext here is immunity is really the ability of your immune system and your cells to distinguish self versus everything that is non-self. But where you get that and how it comes about varies. So the biggest division, first of all, is that. We've got innate immunity. And innate immunity is basically not contingent upon you having encountered the pathogen before. It's built in. So it's any measure against pathogens that is genetically set and which is more general. So innate immunity stuff that you might recognize includes having skin. So just a barrier between you and the outside world. Also part of innate immunity are things like so we think of these white blood cells as being specific, but actually it's only the lymphocytes that are part of specific immunity. These guys are generalists. So neutrophils like to eat bacteria. They don't recognize the kinds of bacteria. They're not like, oh, that was a staphylococcus and this one is a tuberculosis. It doesn't make the distinction at all. They just eat bacteria. That's what they're good at. And similar eosinophils, they're pretty good at combating parasite infections. They don't care what kind of parasite. So they're considered innate and general for that reason. So now we have the more complicated specific / adaptive. And this is basically the opposite. So prior exposure based. And this is complicated because you have two forms, active and passive. And within each of these, you've got artificial and natural, and same. Okay, so let's start with active versus passive. Active is, we'll do this in a different color. How's that? Pink. This is produced by exposure to the antigen. So another way to think of it is being the part of your immune system, specific immune system, that is learning germs. It learns each germ as it's exposed. Passive is get antibodies from some other source. So while we're talking about antibodies, let's talk about what artificial passive immunity would look like. So if you're getting antibodies from somewhere else and it's artificial, that is basically, that's the abbreviation for antibodies. Antibodies used as a drug. I'm going to put that in quotes.
So is that symbol that you used for the B in antibodies the same as the one that means proportional to?
No, proportional is this one, where it's almost an infinity sign, but it's not closed.
Okay.
This is the Greek character alpha, the lowercase version of it. So when people that do immunology are abbreviating antibodies, like all of my lab notebooks from grad school, it's easier to write alpha B than it is to write antibodies every single time. So I'm abbreviating it that way. All right. So this one is, well, let's give you some examples. Anti-Venom. So the way that if you're familiar with anti-venom is one of the options for treatment if somebody is bitten by a venomous animal, usually a snake. What anti-venom actually is are antibodies against the venom protein that are developed in another animal, usually, typically horses. Horses have this unique property where they're very resistant to venoms, and you can inject tiny amounts of venom into a horse. The horse will not die, but the horse's immune system will develop antibodies against the venom, which can then be harvested from the horse's plasma and used to save human lives. So anti-venom is not vegan, usually. Sorry, guys. Also, the rabies vaccine. So if you're familiar at all with the rabies vaccine, you know that it's one of those weird vaccines that you don't get in advance of an infection. So it's not part of the vaccine schedule for young children. And that's because the rabies vaccine is not an attenuated virus. The rabies vaccine is specifically designed to do damage control after a rabies exposure. So the rabies vaccine are antibodies that stick to and deactivate the rabies virus, and that's how they prevent you from getting sick from rabies. So it's only useful to you if you have or maybe have rabies virus already inside you. It's not useful for prevention. And then naturally acquired passive immunity, my bad. It's like somebody said it in the chat actually, from your mother. So basically you acquire from your mom across the placenta during development and in breast milk after birth. Now, I do want to stress for the natural passive immunity stuff. Of course, there's a lot of debate about and around breastfeeding. A lot of people on the internet have a lot of very strong opinions about which thing you should do. And a lot of those arguments are actually centered around this very thing. The amount of antibodies conferred in breast milk is far, far less than what crosses the placenta. And it's generally only one class of antibodies, immunoglobulin A. It's not to say that it's not effective, it's just not like this miraculous panacea for infant problems that some people who are aggressively pro breast milk will tell you about. It's just like, it's great if you can do it. If you don't, it's not a death sentence for your infant. Contrary to what some people on Reddit would have you believe, you're not a bad mom if you don't or can't breastfeed. Most of the passive immunity comes from placental transfer, not from breast milk. All right. So let's talk about active. So natural is just exposure to stuff in the environment. And then artificial, this is vaccines. So for these kinds of things, you have a lot of different options. It's usually a heat-killed pathogen. Can't write today. There we go. Or it's been molecularly disabled or hobbled in some way. Or it's just part of the protein coat of the virus, not the actual RNA or DNA of the virus that's inside. Or in the case of the COVID vaccine, it's a piece of messenger RNA. Because of course, viruses, in order to reproduce, basically steal your cells, ribosomes and endoplasmic reticulum, and all of the cells' polymerases in order to make more copies of virus. And part of that step is producing viral mRNA. So if you administer a vaccine that contains viral mRNA, and that can get noticed by the immune system, that's a way for any viral activity at all to be quickly and efficiently dealt with by the immune system without getting sick. And so for more information on that, I did make a podcast episode about that stuff and the mRNA vaccine, and what it can and can't do and what it really means. So if you're curious about that, go listen. But yeah, that's kind of the immunity tree.
I think my brain just must be topped out on learning vocab. So where does humoral fit into that?
Great question. So let's separately describe those. So when we say humoral immunity, we mean B cells and antibodies. Cellular means T cells. So humoral versus cellular is a way of talking about whether you're looking at the T cell side of things or whether you're looking at the antibody and B cell side of things. And that is because the place that antibodies are effective in the plasma and interstitial fluid. Coming from the humors, which is a very early medical idea that there was different, humans are made of different kinds of goops. And if you have a sort of uneven distribution of those goops, that's what makes you sick. And so obviously, we've moved past that generalization medically, but some of the terminology has stuck around, and one of those is humoral. So humoral refers to the blood, plasma, and serum and the interstitial fluid. And because that's where antibodies act, we talk about humoral immunity that way. But you can't ignore B cells because, of course, plasma cells create antibodies. And then cellular is just T cells because they do cell-on-cell violence. So if we go back to our chart about immunity, you'll notice that passive immunity is either you get antibodies put into you to combat an infection, or you receive them from mom. So the humoral immunity is related to passive specifically, but active immunity is related to both. So that's how those two terms kind of link up.
That was really helpful.
Yay, good. That is what I want.